The evening at the luxury restaurant began like any other, but the atmosphere shifted the moment the billionaire walked through the glass doors, his polished shoes tapping against the marble floor, as though announcing his presence before his voice ever could. And instantly, the quiet murmur of conversations lowered into uneasy silence. He carried himself with a kind of confidence that came from years of wealth and influence, his suit perfectly tailored, his watch gleaming under the soft lights. And though he said nothing at first, everyone in the room seemed to know that someone important had arrived, because the staff rushed to adjust the chairs, polish the cutlery, and make sure every detail was flawless, for no one wanted to risk displeasing such a man. Among the busy waiters was a young waitress who kept her head down, focusing on her tray as she steadied her breath, for she had served many difficult guests before, but something about this evening felt different, almost heavier, as if a storm were waiting to break. She noticed how her fellow workers moved more carefully, how the chef peeked nervously from the kitchen, and how the other diners watched with curiosity, wondering what kind of man demanded this level of attention. And though the billionaire had not yet spoken a word, his silence seemed louder than anything else in the room. The waitress reminded herself to stay calm, to do her duty without faltering, yet deep inside, she could not shake the thought that this man's presence would alter the course of her night in ways she could not predict. And as he finally took his seat by the tall windows that overlooked the city's glittering skyline, the air seemed to tighten around him, every eye drawn to the table where power had chosen to rest. She adjusted her apron and prepared to approach, unaware that the choices made in the next few moments would ripple far beyond this dining hall, turning an ordinary evening into a memory no one present would ever forget. The soft clinking of silverware and the gentle hum of voices returned to the restaurant after the billionaire settled into his seat, but the calm shattered once more when the servers carefully laid his meal before him. For the moment the steaming dishes touched the table, he lifted his hand in a slow, deliberate motion, summoning the same waitress who had been watching nervously from across the room. She walked toward him with careful steps, the tray balanced in her hands, her heart pounding as she felt every eye in the restaurant turn to follow her path. And when she reached the table, the billionaire leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes narrowing in quiet command, before speaking in a voice that was low but heavy with arrogance, telling her to taste the food before him, his words carrying the weight of demand rather than request, a cold order that cut through the air like a blade. The diners nearby froze in shock, forks hanging mid-air, while the other staff members exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions reflecting both disbelief and fear. For such a command was not common, not in a place built on elegance and respect, and yet the billionaire spoke as though it were his right, as though the dignity of another person was a price too small for his peace of mind. The waitress stood still for a heartbeat, her mind racing between duty and pride, her cheeks burning under the stares of strangers. And though she had faced rudeness before, this moment was different. This was not impatience or complaint, but a deliberate attempt to show power, to make her smaller in front of an audience, to remind everyone that money could bend the rules of courtesy. Silence fell heavier with every second, the hum of conversation gone, the clatter of plates absent, as if the entire room waited for her reaction. And in that tense stillness, the billionaire tapped his fingers against the polished table, his smirk faint but unmistakable, as if he enjoyed the discomfort he caused, as if this was entertainment. The waitress swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she lowered her tray, and though her lips wanted to form words of protest, her sense of duty bound her, leaving her torn between her pride and her position. But deep in her chest a small spark stirred, the kind of spark that grows when injustice is too sharp to ignore. And while she finally reached for the spoon, as he demanded, her eyes met his for a fleeting second, her gaze calm yet defiant, a look that carried more strength than any spoken word. And though no one knew it at that moment, That single act of forced obedience would soon set into motion a chain of events that would forever change not only the billionaire, but also every soul who witnessed what was about to unfold. The spoon felt heavier than it should have as the waitress lifted it, her hand steady, despite the storm of emotions tightening inside her chest. And though her heart raced with unease, her face remained calm, her eyes lowered just enough to mask the flicker of resistance she carried deep within. She tasted the food exactly as he demanded, her movements graceful and without complaint. But beneath that silence was a quiet defiance, a hidden strength that no command could erase. And when she set the spoon back down on the edge of the plate, her gaze lifted just enough to meet the billionaire's eyes, not long enough to be bold, not sharp enough to be disrespectful, yet filled with something steady, something unspoken that unsettled him in ways he would never admit. He had expected to see fear, perhaps even humiliation, but what he saw was a woman who would not let his wealth steal her dignity, a woman who could be ordered but not broken. And that simple truth pressed against his pride like a shadow he could not shake. Around them, the restaurant had grown eerily quiet, every guest leaning into the moment as though the smallest breath might shatter the fragile air. And from every corner, eyes watched her with different emotions, some with pity, saddened that she was forced into such a role, and others with quiet disapproval. Their frowns aimed not at her, but at the man who demanded such a thing. Yet none spoke aloud, for his power hung over them like an invisible chain, silencing words they dared not share. Still, the energy in the room had shifted, for though the billionaire sat taller in his chair, pretending indifference, a ripple of unease ran beneath his composure, a whisper in his mind that perhaps he had gone too far, though his pride refused to let him see it clearly. The waitress stepped back from the table, placing her hands against her apron, her expression calm, her shoulders straight, and in that small act of composure, she displayed more dignity than the man who had tried to strip it from her. And while the crowd did not clap or cheer, their eyes told the story, admiration for her strength, judgment for his arrogance, and suspense that lingered in the air like the final note of a song waiting to resolve. And though the billionaire lifted his fork and carried on as if nothing had happened, each bite seemed heavier, each moment slower, for deep within he could not silence the image of her steady gaze, the look that told him silently that respect was not something wealth could buy. And as she walked away to tend to another table, he realized that for the first time in years, he was not the one in control of the room, for the power had quietly shifted, resting not in the hands of the richest man there, but in the quiet courage of the woman who stood her ground without saying a word. For a moment, the restaurant seemed frozen in time as the waitress stepped back, her task completed, and nothing unusual happened, no alarm, no mistake, only silence hanging in the air like a curtain drawn too tightly. The billionaire leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smirk, as though the stillness itself confirmed his superiority, his eyes sweeping over the room with quiet triumph. Certain he had reminded everyone of the weight his wealth carried, but what he failed to notice, at least at first, was the way the atmosphere had shifted, for while no one dared to speak loudly, a current of whispers began to stir, like a hidden wind, among the tables. Soft voices, exchanging thoughts too sharp to say aloud, yet too strong to keep inside. Guests leaned toward each other with furrowed brows, asking silently why such a powerful man needed to prove himself by forcing a simple waitress to do what he was too proud to do himself. And though their words were hushed, the message carried, a quiet wave of disapproval that spread through the room. One man lowered his glass slowly, staring at the billionaire with a look that mixed disbelief with quiet disgust, while a woman shook her head gently, her lips pressing into a thin line of disappointment. And even the staff, though trained to remain neutral, could not fully mask the flicker of unease in their eyes, for they too wondered why dignity had to be sacrificed for one man's pride. Yet, the billionaire, lost in the illusion of his own power, mistook the silence for respect, mistook the stillness for awe. And every bite he took from his plate was filled with the arrogance of someone who believed the world bent only to his will. Meanwhile, the waitress carried on with her duties, her expression calm, but those who had watched closely carried her image in their minds, the quiet strength in her eyes, the dignity that had not faltered despite his demandant. As she passed by, more than one diner offered her a faint smile of support, a silent gesture that spoke louder than the billionaire's smirk ever could. Still, beneath the golden lights and polished surfaces of the restaurant, tension clung to the air, a subtle but undeniable weight that made even casual conversation feel forced, as though everyone knew they were part of something uncomfortable, something that revealed more about character than wealth. And though no one openly confronted him, the truth was already written across the room. The billionaire may have believed he won a small game, but in reality, he had planted a seed of doubt about himself in every mind that witnessed it, a seed that would soon grow into a storm he could not control. The quiet tension that had wrapped itself around the restaurant finally cracked when the waitress, having finished the humiliating task, gently set the spoon down on the edge of the billionaire's plate, her movements calm and deliberate as though she carried no bitterness. And yet, when she straightened her posture and looked at him, her eyes steady and voice unshaken, her words cut through the heavy silence like a blade of truth. She asked, in a tone that was neither loud nor trembling, whether being wealthy meant forgetting respect, and though the question was simple, it landed with the weight of something much greater, echoing in the ears of everyone present. The billionaire's smirk faltered, not because of the words themselves, but because of the courage behind them, courage he did not expect from someone he thought beneath him. For a brief second, his expression shifted, the mask of arrogance slipping to reveal surprise, even discomfort, before he forced it back into place. But the damage had been done. Her quiet defiance had pierced the armor of pride he wore so tightly. Around them, the diners leaned in, their eyes fixed on the scene, some holding their breath, others silently cheering her bravery, because what she had said was something many of them had thought but never dared to voice. Even the waitstaff paused, pretending to busy themselves but clearly drawn to the power of the moment. For it was rare to see someone of her position stand so firmly against someone of his stature. The billionaire shifted in his seat, gripping the arm of his chair a little tighter, suddenly aware that the attention he had demanded with his earlier show of power had now turned against him. And though he wanted to dismiss her words with a laugh or a wave of his hand, he found himself unable to, because deep down, he knew the question carried truth. In that instant, he was reminded that money could command service, but it could never buy respect, and no matter how grand his fortune, he could not silence the quiet strength of one voice that spoke with honesty. The room seemed to grow warmer, the golden lights above, reflecting not just on polished tables, but on the faces of strangers, united by a shared feeling admiration for the woman who had dared to speak, and judgment for the man who had forced her into it. The waitress, however, did not linger on her words. She did not push further. She simply stood with dignity, her calm presence saying more than anger ever could. And in that restraint lay the true sting of her response, because it showed she did not need power or wealth to stand tall. The billionaire, now stripped of the control he thought unshakable, leaned back slowly, his mind racing as whispers swelled once again across the room. Only this time they were not questioning him in secret. They were openly carrying the weight of her words, words that he could not escape. Words that had already begun to change the story of the night. For the first time in as long as he could remember, the billionaire felt the weight of eyes not filled with admiration or envy, but with something sharper, heavier judgment, and not for his power, not for his wealth, but for the way he had chosen to use it. The realization struck him like a sudden draft in a warm room, invisible yet undeniable, and though he attempted to cover it with a practiced chuckle, the sound rang hollow, brittle in a way that even he could hear. He shifted slightly in his chair, pretending to adjust his suit jacket, but his hands trembled just enough to betray him to those who were watching closely. The room no longer belonged to him. The atmosphere he once dominated now carried a different energy, one he could not control, because the waitress's words had planted seeds in the minds of everyone present, seeds of quiet resistance that now bloomed into open stares, whispers, and in some cases, bold glares that told him he had crossed a line no amount of money could erase. He lifted his glass and sipped, hoping the simple act would return normalcy. But even the water tasted strange, heavy on his tongue, as though it carried the weight of the shame slowly creeping into his chest. Shame was not an emotion he was used to. For years he had silenced it with luxury, drowned it with applause, hidden it behind the mirror of arrogance he carried everywhere. But tonight, that mirror cracked, and in a fracture, he saw a version of himself he had long buried, a man desperate for control, terrified of appearing weak, and willing to trample on dignity to feed his own pride. The silence of the diners was louder than any insult, and though no one spoke, he could feel their thoughts pressing against him, 1,000 invisible accusations that stripped him bare. He told himself he did not care, that he was above them all. Yet deep down, a faint echo stirred, a feeling so foreign it frightened him. It was the sting of conscience, the shadow of guilt, the faint voice of a man he once was before power hardened his heart. His smile wavered again, his laugh faded, and though he straightened his back and tilted his chin as though unbothered, his eyes betrayed the storm within. The waitress, still standing with calm dignity, said nothing more, yet her silence spoke volumes. Her presence, a quiet mirror, reflecting back his behavior, and he hated what he saw. He tried to search the faces around him for one ally, one look of agreement, but all he found were lowered eyes of disappointment or bold stares of disapproval, and that truth unsettled him more than any direct confrontation could have, for it showed him that the power he thought unshakable was far weaker than he had believed. In that moment, sitting beneath the warm lights of a restaurant he once thought too small for his presence, the billionaire felt smaller than ever before, as if the entire room had conspired to show him what he truly was, not the giant he imagined, but a man who had mistaken fear for respect, and who now faced the beginnings of a shame he could not laugh away. The silence that had hung like a heavy curtain in the restaurant was suddenly broken by the sound of hands clapping, soft at first, uncertain, but growing louder and stronger as more diners joined in, until the quiet murmur of disapproval transformed into a steady wave of applause, directed not at the billionaire, but at the waitress who had spoken with dignity. She stood there, still in her simple uniform, her hands folded calmly in front of her, eyes steady, and though she had not sought recognition, the room rose to give it to her, their faces lit, not with pity, but with admiration for the courage she had shown in the face of arrogance. The billionaire, who was used to applause following his name, his speeches, his wealth, now found himself stunned as the sounds surrounded him, but did not belong to him, each clap echoing in his ears, like a reminder of the respect money could never buy. He tried to lift his chin, tried to maintain the posture of power, but the rhythm of the applause pierced through the armor of his pride, reminding him that while he had forced obedience through fear, this young woman had earned respect through strength of character, and that truth unsettled him more deeply than any insult could have. He glanced around, searching for eyes that might still side with him, but everywhere he looked he saw admiration directed at her, people nodding, smiling, whispering to each other about her courage, while he, with all his wealth and influence, stood in the shadow of her dignity. His fork hovered above his plate, forgotten, as he felt a strange hollowness settle in his chest, an emptiness that even his billions could not fill. And in that hollowness came the realization that respect built on fear and pride was fragile, ready to shatter the moment someone brave enough stood against it. The waitress did not bask in the applause, did not bow or smile with triumph. She simply stood firm, her calmness only adding to the power of the moment, as if her silence itself was a quiet lesson to everyone watching. And in that lesson the billionaire saw something he had long ignored, that true strength was not in making others bend, but in standing tall without cruelty, and true wealth was not measured by what one owned, but by the respect one earned through humility and kindness. His pride, once untouchable, began to falter as he felt the applause rising and falling like waves against his ears, drowning out his ego, forcing him to confront the truth that in this room, in this single moment, he was no longer the center of power, but a man exposed, humbled by the dignity of someone he had tried to humiliate. And though he did not yet know how to face it, he could not escape the haunting realization that she had gained in a single evening what he had chased all his life and failed to hold: respect that was real, honest, and lasting. When the applause faded and the clinking of glasses returned, the restaurant seemed to breathe again, yet the billionaire remained unsettled, his mind replaying the sound of hands clapping for someone else, for someone he had tried to diminish. For a long while he sat in silence, his food untouched, his thoughts circling around the calm strength of the waitress and the faces of those who had chosen her side. And though his pride urged him to stand tall and act unfazed, another quieter voice inside whispered that he could not walk away unchanged. Finally, unable to shake the heaviness pressing against his chest, he lifted his hand and asked softly for her to return, his voice carrying none of the commanding sharpness it once had. And when she approached, cautious yet composed, he felt an unfamiliar hesitation knot in his throat, a hesitation born not from fear of her but from fear of revealing the truth about himself. For years, his words had been weapons, each one polished with arrogance, but now they faltered, stripped of grandeur, and what slipped out instead was something raw, something he had nearly forgotten how to give an apology. He did not mask it with excuses, did not cloak it in charm. His tone lowered to something almost fragile as he admitted he was wrong, that his demand had been unkind, that he had treated her with less dignity than she deserved. The diners nearby tilted their heads, surprised by the softness in his voice, for it sounded unlike the man they thought they knew, and even the staff who had grown used to his pride exchanged glances as though witnessing a rare event, like thunder giving way to rain. The waitress stood still, listening, her face calm, her silence pressing him to continue. And in that silence he felt the weight of sincerity pulling at him, urging him to go deeper than hollow words. His chest tightened as he realized that this was perhaps the first genuine apology he had spoken in years, maybe decades, for he had long hidden behind power and forgotten how to bow his head. And though his words were simple, stripped of ornament, they carried more meaning than any speech he had ever delivered to crowds that cheered for his fortune. For this time he was not speaking to impress or to command, but to acknowledge the humanity in someone else, someone he had wronged. And as the words left his lips, a strange quietness settled within him. Not the empty silence of arrogance, but the steady peace of honesty, fragile but real. The waitress gave no grand reply, no speech of her own. She simply nodded once, a small gesture of acceptance, and though it was subtle, it struck him with more force than any applause, because it told him that forgiveness was possible, that dignity once broken could be restored when humility was chosen. And as she walked away, continuing her work with quiet grace, he sat back with a heart heavier yet lighter, stunned at how a few sincere words, spoken without grandeur, had begun to crack open the man he had built from pride, revealing someone he had not allowed himself to be in years. The billionaire sat waiting for her reaction, expecting perhaps bitterness or a sharp remark that would remind him of the humiliation he had caused. But when the waitress finally spoke, her voice was neither cold nor proud. It was steady and warm, filled with a kindness so unexpected that it disarmed him completely. She told him she forgave him, not because he was powerful, not because he was wealthy, but because holding on to anger only made the world heavier, and in that simple kindness was a lesson he had never learned in boardrooms or mansions, a lesson that cut deeper than the harshest criticism could have. For years he had measured his strength by how much he could control, how many deals he could win, how many people bowed when he entered a room. But in this moment, faced with the gentle grace of someone he had tried to diminish, he realized that true strength was not in bending others, but in standing tall, without cruelty, and extending kindness even to those who had been unkind. The words rattled inside him, striking a part of his heart that had long been buried beneath pride, and the more he tried to shake them off, the more they echoed, until he felt the ground beneath his confidence tremble. It shook him more than any failed investment, more than any business setback, because money could be earned again, deals could be replaced, but this feeling, this humbling weight of humanity, was something he had no power over, and it left him unsteady in a way he had never known. The diners who had witnessed the scene looked on with quiet approval, not cheering this time, but watching with a kind of reverence, as if they knew they were witnessing a rare moment when arrogance cracked and something honest broke through. He lowered his gaze for perhaps the first time in years, not to study a contract or to read figures, but to avoid the sharp truth in the waitress's eyes that reflected not judgment, but compassion. And it was that compassion that unraveled him more than anger ever could. He realized then that being feared had brought him obedience, but never respect. Being rich had bought him attention, but never connection. And in this one act of forgiveness, the waitress had shown him a wealth greater than anything his billions could ever buy. His hands, usually so steady in signing deals worth fortunes, trembled slightly as he reached for his glass, his mind spinning with the dawning truth that he was not untouchable, that beneath all the power he had collected, he was still a man capable of being broken, capable of being humbled, and perhaps capable of being changed. And though he said nothing more in that moment, a shift had begun inside him, quiet but undeniable. A turning point he could not ignore, as if her kindness had lit a mirror within him, forcing him to see not the billionaire the world feared, but the human being he had long forgotten to be. In the weeks that followed, a quiet but undeniable change began to unfold in the billionaire's life, and those around him were the first to notice it. For the man who once entered every room with an air of superiority now walked with a calmer presence, his voice softer, his tone measured, as though the arrogance that once weighed on every word had been replaced by something humbler. His staff, long accustomed to sharp commands and cold indifference, found themselves startled when he greeted them with respect, asking for their opinions, thanking them for their work. Small gestures that seemed ordinary to most, but felt extraordinary coming from him. The news of that night at the restaurant had spread far beyond the walls where it happened, whispered first as gossip, then shared as a story with meaning, until it reached circles of power, where he was no longer seen as untouchable, but as a man who had been humbled, and surprisingly, the tale did not ruin him, as he once feared it, reshaped him. He began to give generously, not in the loud, performative way of public donations meant to earn applause, but in quiet acts that carried sincerity, supporting causes without attaching his name, helping those who could never repay him, as though he had finally learned that wealth was not a crown to wear, but a tool to serve. In board meetings, where once he crushed every opposing voice, he now listened, really listened, and his partners watched with disbelief as he admitted when he was wrong, a sentence they had never imagined he would speak. But perhaps the greatest change was not in his actions, but in his outlook, for he began to see people not as staff, rival, but as human beings with dignity, each one deserving of respect no matter their station. A truth that had been so clear to the waitress that night, but so distant from him until she had held a mirror to his arrogance. And though he never sought to erase what he had done, he carried it with him as a reminder, a scar not on his body, but on his pride, a mark that kept him grounded. The memory of the applause for her, the sting of her question, the warmth of her forgiveness, these became the compass that guided him forward. And so the night that began with arrogance, with a demand meant to humiliate, transformed into a lesson he could never forget. A lesson that power without respect is hollow, that dignity cannot be bought, and that kindness, even when it comes from the most unexpected place, has the power to break down the strongest walls of pride. And in the years that followed, when people spoke of him, they no longer told stories of his wealth or his ruthless victories, but of the night he was humbled by a waitress and chose to change, a night that turned into a legacy, not of money or power, but of humanity rediscovered.